Lehman Brothers was founded in 1850 in a cotton trading town in Alabama by three immigrant brothers. It survived the American Civil War. It survived the railroad crashes of the 19th century, the Panic of 1907, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and every recession in between. By 2007, it was the 4th largest investment bank in the United States, with a $600 billion balance sheet and 25,000 employees across the world. In September 2008, it collapsed in the space of a single weekend, and the global economy nearly went down with it. This is the long fall of Lehman Brothers. To understand the shock of what happened in 2008, you have to understand how old and how durable Lehman Brothers was. It began as a dry goods store opened by Henry Lehman in Montgomery, Alabama in 1844. His brothers, Emanuel and Mayer, joined him, and the store began accepting raw cotton as payment from local farmers. Within a few years, the brothers realized the cotton was worth more than the goods. They became cotton traders, then commodity brokers, then, by the late 19th century, a Wall Street firm. For more than a century, Lehman Brothers did the patient, unglamorous work of American capitalism. It helped finance railroads and retailers. It helped take companies public. It was a co-founder in spirit of the modern New York Stock Exchange. It survived the Panic of 1907 and the crash of 1929. It survived the Great Depression. It survived being absorbed by a larger firm in the 1980s and then, remarkably, being spun back out as an independent company in 1994. The lesson that Lehman drew from this long history was a dangerous one. The firm came to believe, deep in its institutional bones, that it always survived. That survival was simply what Lehman Brothers did. By the early 2000s, Lehman Brothers was led by a chief executive named Richard Fuld, a man who had spent his entire working life at the firm. Fuld had started at Lehman as a trader. He was intense, combative, fiercely loyal, and known on Wall Street by a single word: the gorilla. He had pulled Lehman through the panic that followed the September 11th attacks, when the firm's headquarters were damaged and it had to relocate overnight. He believed in the firm with a near religious conviction, and that conviction, which had been a strength for so long, was about to become the thing that blinded him, because a man who believes his firm always survives is a man who will not plan for the day it might not. In the years between 2000 and 2007, the most profitable business on Wall Street was the American home. And Lehman Brothers built itself a place near the very center of it. The business worked like an assembly line. A bank or a broker would lend money to a home buyer. That mortgage loan would be sold to a Wall Street firm. The firm would gather thousands of mortgages together into a single bundle and then sell slices of that bundle to investors all over the world as a bond. These were called mortgage-backed securities, and Lehman became one of the largest manufacturers of them on the planet. It was a genuinely lucrative business, and for a while, it was not obviously reckless. But there was an engine inside it that demanded constant fuel. To keep the assembly line running, you needed a constant supply of new mortgages. And by the mid-2000s, almost everyone in America who could responsibly afford a home loan already had one. So the industry began making loans to people who could not. Loans with no down payment. Loans with no proof of income. Loans whose monthly payments were low for 2 years and then jumped to a level the borrower had never been able to afford. The assembly line did not slow down. It simply lowered its standards to keep itself fed. And Lehman did something with this business that the other banks also did, but that Lehman did with particular enthusiasm. It used borrowed money. An investment bank operates on what is called leverage. For every dollar of its own money, it borrows many more dollars to invest. By 2007, Lehman Brothers was leveraged at roughly 30-1. For every dollar the firm truly owned, it had borrowed and invested about 30. At that ratio, the arithmetic is brutal and simple. If the assets the firm holds fall in value by just 3 or 4%, the firm's own money is entirely wiped out. Lehman had built a $600 billion tower on a foundation of equity barely thick enough to notice. As long as house prices kept rising, no one looked down. Not everyone at Lehman Brothers was blind. This is the part of the story that makes it a tragedy rather than simply a mistake. Inside the firm, there were people who looked at the mortgage business in 2006 and 2007 and saw clearly what it had become. One of them was a senior executive named Michael Gelband, who ran the firm's fixed income division. Gelband argued that the housing market was a bubble, that the firm was taking on too much risk, and that it needed to pull back. He was, in effect, pushed aside. Richard Fuld and the firm's president, Joseph Gregory, wanted growth. They wanted Lehman to take more risk, not less, to close the gap with the larger banks ahead of it. So while some competitors began quietly reducing their exposure to mortgages in 2007, Lehman did the opposite. It bought more. It acquired mortgage lenders. It made an enormous bet on commercial real estate near the very top of the market. The voices inside the firm warning that the music was about to stop were not ignored out of stupidity. They were overruled by a leadership that had decided the firm's history of survival was a kind of guarantee, and that the people counseling caution simply lacked nerve. In early 2008, the warnings began arriving from outside the firm as well. A young hedge fund manager named David Einhorn publicly questioned Lehman's accounting, arguing that the firm was not honestly marking down the value of its troubled assets. Lehman pushed back hard, angrily, and insisted its books were sound. But the market had begun to do the thing that is fatal to a bank. It had begun to doubt. And an investment bank, in the end, is not really built of buildings or traders or balance sheets. It is built of confidence, the willingness of other institutions to lend it money overnight, every night, on trust. The moment that trust wavers, the countdown has already begun. In March 2008, 6 months before Lehman's collapse, the country received a clear and terrifying preview. Bear Stearns, the 5th largest investment bank in the United States, ran out of money in a matter of days. Bear Stearns held the same kinds of mortgage assets as Lehman. It used the same enormous leverage, and when its trading partners and lenders lost confidence, they all pulled their money back at once. A silent electronic bank run, conducted entirely between institutions. Bear Stearns went from apparently healthy to effectively insolvent in roughly 72 hours. To prevent a wider panic, the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury arranged an emergency rescue. The bank, J.P. Morgan Chase, agreed to buy Bear Stearns, at first for the almost insulting price of $2 a share, with the government backstopping the worst of the risk. The crisis was contained, the system held, and Lehman Brothers drew precisely the wrong lesson from it. Inside Lehman, the rescue of Bear Stearns was read as proof that the government would not allow a major investment bank to fail. The firm believed it had just watched a safety net be installed beneath it. It had not. It had watched the one and only rescue the political system had the appetite to perform. Through the summer of 2008, Lehman's situation deteriorated. The firm reported a loss of nearly $3 billion for a single quarter, its first loss since becoming independent. Richard Fuld spent the summer searching, with growing desperation, for a way out. He sought new investment from sovereign wealth funds in Korea and the Middle East. He explored selling part of the firm. He tried to spin off the worst of the commercial real estate assets. But every potential rescuer looked at Lehman's books, saw assets that nobody could honestly value, and walked away. The firm that believed it always survived was, by September, a firm running out of every option except the one it refused to imagine. The end of Lehman Brothers happened over a single weekend, the weekend of September 13th and 14th, 2008. It is one of the most documented 72-hour stretches in the history of finance. On that Friday, federal officials summoned the leaders of every major Wall Street bank to the offices of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in Lower Manhattan. The message was blunt. Lehman Brothers would not survive the coming Monday without a buyer, and this time, the government did not intend to put public money on the table. 2 possible rescuers emerged that weekend. One was Bank of America. The other was the British bank Barclays. For 2 days, in conference rooms full of exhausted bankers and lawyers, the rescue was assembled and taken apart and assembled again. Bank of America pulled away and instead agreed that same weekend to buy a different troubled firm, Merrill Lynch, which had seen Lehman's fate coming and chosen to be sold while it still could. That left Barclays. and the Barclays deal came genuinely close. But it required the approval of British regulators, and the British regulators refused to let Barclays take on Lehman's enormous risks without a shareholder vote that there was no time to hold. On Sunday, the last door closed. There was no buyer, and there would be no rescue. In the early hours of Monday, September 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It listed assets of more than $600 billion. It remains, by a wide margin, the largest bankruptcy filing in the history of the United States. In the firm's offices around the world, 25,000 employees arrived at work that morning to find that the institution they worked for had ceased overnight to exist. Many of them carried their belongings out in cardboard boxes through a crowd of photographers, and a photograph of a Lehman employee walking out with a box became, for a generation, the single image of the financial crisis. The people who let Lehman fail believed, or hoped, that the damage could be contained. It could not. Lehman Brothers was not a standalone building. It was a knot in a web tied by countless contracts to every other major financial institution on earth. When it failed, every one of those threads snapped at once. Within 24 hours, a money market fund that had lent money to Lehman announced it had lost so much that it could no longer guarantee its investors a full dollar back for every dollar they had put in. In the language of finance, the fund had broken the buck. And that phrase set off a panic in what was supposed to be the safest corner of the entire system. Lending between banks froze. Institutions stopped trusting one another because no one knew who else was holding a fatal amount of the same poison. The day after Lehman fell, the United States government was forced to seize and bail out the insurance giant AIG, which was hours from collapse. The failure that was supposed to teach the market a lesson about consequences had instead lit the fuse on a global financial crisis. And the rescue the government had refused to give Lehman, it would now spend hundreds of billions of dollars trying to give to everyone else. You can tell the story of Lehman Brothers as a story about subprime mortgages. You can tell it as a story about reckless leverage, $30 borrowed for every dollar owned. You can tell it as a story about a government that drew its line in the wrong place on the wrong weekend. All of those things are true, and all of them mattered. But underneath them is something older and more human, and it had been growing inside the firm for a century and a half. Lehman Brothers was killed by the memory of its own survival. It had lived through the Civil War, the Depression, 2 world wars, the crash of 1987, the panic after September 11th. Every one of those escapes taught the firm the same lesson, that Lehman endures, that Lehman is the one that makes it through. And so when the warnings came from inside the firm and outside it, the leadership did not truly hear them, because the leadership knew with the certainty of 150 years of evidence that the firm always found a way. That belief was not crazy. It had been correct every single time until the time it was not. No competitor delivered the fatal blow to Lehman Brothers. It was killed by a confidence so old and so deeply earned that it had hardened into the one thing a bank can never afford: the inability to imagine its own end. Lehman Brothers survived for 158 years. The Civil War, the Depression, every panic the modern economy could produce. In September 2008, it fell in a single weekend, and the global financial system fell after it. And the world spent years and trillions of dollars climbing back out. The headquarters tower still stands in Midtown Manhattan. Another bank's name is on the crown of it now. The boxes the employees carried out have long since been unpacked somewhere else. Thank you for watching The Long Fall. If decline stories like this one interest you, the channel will be here.